This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app or join our emailing list at coldwarconversations.com. Jack Wesolek was born in East Germany in 1966. His grandfather was a member of the Red Orchestra, a communist anti-Nazi resistance organisation in Germany during World War II. He later becomes chief of the signal service of the Volksmarine, the East German Navy, and in the 1980s an East German Army Signals Regiment is named after him. Jack's father was an actor, and we discuss how accurate the depiction of East German actors is in the film The Lives of Others. Aged 6, his parents divorce, and Jack stays with his father and grandmother in Rostock, where he learns more about his grandfather's story. However, he's separated from his brother, who goes to live with his mother. Jack has an uncle who was captured escaping from East Germany and has been bought out by West Germany in the 1970s. At a clandestine meeting in Hungary, they hatch a daring plan for Jack to escape across the inner German border, the fortified frontier between East and West Germany. I'm delighted to welcome Jack Wesolek to our Cold War conversation.
So I was born in Wittenberg, which is Lutherstadt Wittenberg. That is where Martin Luther started the Reformation more than 700 years ago. So I was born in a Christian hospital in Wittenberg, and that was in 1966. So I did not spend too much time in Wittenberg. So the vast majority of my upbringing was like different small towns, like Gera for once, but the vast majority of my upbringing was in Rostock, the port city of Rostock.
What did your parents do? Did your parents' jobs mean that you were moving around? Is that why you were moving?
Yes. So my parents were fairly young. So they were 23 when I was born. My dad was. He was an actor. He had an engagement at the theater in Wittenberg. He met my mother. My mother was at this time becoming a doctor. And then my dad moved around with his theater engagements. Like he went in, the next engagement, I believe, was in Gera. So I have like early childhood memories of living in Gera, which was like a building which survived the war. I remember we really didn't have like a toilet in our flat. It was like a half stage down, and you shared it with your neighbor. So it was like all fairly dreary. But I do remember like they had a nice park. I do remember they had like a nice fountain, and I do remember the theater, which was like fantastic with like a crown chandelier, and obviously like early childhood memories of seeing my dad on stage. Yeah, and that was my early childhood that I remember with like kindergarten, and then what happened was my parents divorced, and I did move on my paternal side up to Rostock, where my grandmother lived, and that's where then my main childhood took place or happened. Yeah.
Having a father who's an actor, that immediately reminds me of The Lives of Others. Now, you know, you must have had some quite interesting parties, I guess. I'm saying it at your house.
Yeah, so it's quite a different type of people, so to speak. I remember also, like even from my early childhood, like the New Year's Eve parties, or it's like an interesting bunch of people, which normally really don't fit the mold. But it's also a fairly closed community. So throughout my life, there were like lots and lots of people that we encountered on a regular basis, and sometimes when I see like old East German movies or even some West German movies, there once in a while pops up an actor which I remember not necessarily, but definitely by name and knowing to having encountered them. I mean, they would never remember me, or they probably would remember my dad, but it's first of all, life takes place at a different time because they work at night or work like late in the evenings. I mean, they have like rehearsals during the day, but it's normally a more free spirited bunch of people, I would say. So, and that was quite interesting, which doesn't mean that, finding the reference to the life of others, that there wasn't any like first indoctrination, or people weren't, like, I wouldn't say spy on each other, but report on each other. So there were like always these kind of people that arranged with the system to some degree. But yeah, watching this movie, it's like really a pleasure, because you don't see really like actors portrayed in like movies or the life about actors. And that was like an interesting part to it. Yes.
It's a fascinating movie in terms of that study of how you try and weave a way of trying to have your artistic freedom whilst living in a state like East Germany.
Well, and there were like in history, like good references, right? If you think about like Wolf Biermann, who wasn't allowed to work and then moved to the West, and then people that basically supported him, like Manfred Krug, as a good example. He was a super, super successful actor, singer in East Germany. And then he just moved away because he just couldn't show his artistic side. And he actually made like significant propaganda movies, like Spur der Steine, for example. It's an excellent movie, but it's like fairly in like the GDR theme. And then he felt he couldn't really do anything anymore what he was doing, and then moved to the West. So there were like this movie, The Life of Others, was it was true to some degree, not necessarily all the details. I mean, it was like fairly artistic, but the story around it was like certainly something that was present.
Yeah. I guess, people having to compromise in order to progress within their careers, for example.
Yes, and that was like I actually spoke with my dad too. I mean, my dad was also a party member, which was partially driven by his father, but it was also to enable him to do to travel outside East Germany for engagements that the theater had in back then supportive countries or Western countries. So that was then the necessity to be able to do that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what his view of the regime was. It sounds like what you're saying there is the party membership was to enable him to work abroad rather than an affirmation in the belief in East Germany.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I grew up in like a very, very political household. So both of my grandpa had two sons, which was my dad, who was the younger one, and then his other son was my uncle, and he was a salesman he was basically selling East German chips to other countries. Germany had a fairly large shipbuilding industry, and it wasn't very profitable, but it brought in the much needed foreign currency. And he was also a party member. But I don't remember ever that within the family, and we spent a lot of time together, that it was fairly political. There were jokes made about Honecker and East Germany, the typical German pastime to complain about things. Like all these things happened. So it was not that I felt in any way, shape, or form to be guided into a special direction to blindly follow the doctrine of the state. Mm-hmm. So it was fairly apolitical in my upbringing from the family. We all watched Western TV, so it was, and they all traveled to Western countries. My uncle as a salesman and my dad as an actor. So they brought stuff back, or they saw things. So it wasn't that they really believed everything that Karl Eduard von Schnitzler in the Black Channel basically told the people every I think it was on a weekly basis or even nightly. I have no idea.
I'm not sure I found anybody that believed what he said. But, so, I mean, you mentioned there your grandfather. Your grandfather was in a privileged position because of what he'd done during World War II.
Yeah. So I would say from the reportings that he was a true believer, and that comes basically from his family background and from what he did. So his parents were Stanislaus and Frida Wesolek, who had two sons like Johann and Walter, and they were early Communist Party members. I think in the 20s or 30s they worked for the Communist International, the Comintern. And they were educated and they had radio equipment. So they communicated with Soviet intelligence services during this time. And they also, in the 40s, provided shelter for German communists that returned from, after being educated and trained in the Soviet Union, provided shelter to German paratroopers that came back into Germany. And through that, they were connected with the resistance group, the Red Orchestra, which is a fairly famous one. There was, as far as I know or could research, there was some information leaked by the Russian intelligence service, and the Nazis started arresting Red Orchestra members. I think it was in the mid 40s, like 42. And with that, my grandpa's parents were swept up and arrested. And they were prosecuted by the infamous Nazi prosecutor Manfred Röder. And they were executed in 1943. With that, my grandpa and his brother were also arrested. But my grandpa's brother, and I have absolutely no recollection or connection to him. And I don't think my dad had. So my grandpa was convicted too, and I think there are different stories. It's either 6 years or a life sentence, and he spent his time in the Brandenburg prison. That is basically where he survived the war. There is reportedly some story about him that he joined within the prison a resistance group. So he worked as a forced laborer as a workshop clerk to the war production of the company Bosch, which is pretty known internationally. And there is some report that I saw that he prevented or helped prevent somebody being sent to a concentration camp because he attested that this person is like important for the war production. But again, this is hearsay. So after the war, he joined the East German Navy. He started setting up and building out the signals division of the East German Navy of the Nationale Volksmarine. I don't know much about that further on. I know what his latest rank was, which was Kapitän zur See, which is, I believe, is a captain. He got like lots and lots of medals. I think the highest one was the Vaterländische Verdienstorden in bronze, which there is like a huge list of people that have this. I mean, Katharina Witt, for example, had 2 or 3, but it's like a medal that is given out for. I think it had 2 prongs. One was Nazi resistance, and the other one was like special services to the East German state. And they also named a signals regiment after him, which I believe happened sometime in the 80s, which was the NR-18 Signals Regiment. So he passed away 2 years after I was born. So he passed away in 68. Oh yeah, and he also wrote 3 books. So he was kind of like a very talented person. One of those books was made into a movie too.
Wow.
It's still in like some DEFA repository. It was made after he died in 69. And the three books that he wrote, one was Riffe, which was made into this movie, which then was called, the movie title was Hart am Wind, or Close to the Wind. I'll send you that, and you can put it into the show notes. There's also a description of like what the story is. Then his famous political one, Im Widerstreit, which means like in conflict. And then there was another one, which was Labor hinter Gittern. I remember reading the books. I was not, I have to admit, I was not super enticed. It was very, very political, which obviously speaks to what, like his conviction, and probably like true conviction was, because if you think about it, like in the 60s or in the 50s, 60s, that was the time where East Germany, after the Russians loosened a little bit their reparations, started to build up a society which they believed really could be something better or something different. So I can see that he probably was very much into the system and believed to what he did was really a good thing.
How much did the Wesolek name help potentially your father and your uncle's career? Because it sounds quite unusual for two members of the same family to be allowed to travel abroad.
I honestly, I don't know. I would assume that it did play a role, at least in the beginning. I would probably think maybe more with my uncle.
You said that when your parents divorce, you go and stay with your grandmother. Now, your grandmother, I think, told you most of Johannes's story, and she was quite an important part of your life.
Yes, she was. So given that obviously my dad was always, locked in with his engagements and moving with the divorce of my parents. So basically what happened, my parents divorced. I have a younger brother who's 1 year younger than I am. And when they divorced, they basically divided the families and both moved to opposite parts of the country. So my mother moved far to the south and founded a new family. So her new husband, my brother, and they had another child. The same happened with my dad, who eventually came to Rostock. He married again my stepmother, and they had also another child. Given that when the divorce happened, I was, I believe, 6 or 7 years old, 6 years old probably, and I was about to join the school system. So what basically happened was that they said, okay, we know that we want to live in Rostock, close to my dad's family. And so I moved in with my grandma, who lived like really in walking distance to the school that I joined. And I lived with her when I entered the school system at age of 7. And yes, I mean, she had like these display cases with all my grandfather's medals and books and, ships, like model ships that were, given to him. And it was certainly quite exciting, especially as a kid, to put all those medals on my chest and then not being able to work straight, although they were all like aluminum or cheap metals, so not too heavy, but it was the sheer amount of stuff.
And was your grandmother a believer in real and existing socialism?
So it was quite interesting. I think to some degree, yes, and to another degree, not. So, I mean, she obviously grew up during that time, but she also grew up during the Nazi time. And, like sometimes there were some things in like what she said and how I believe she believed in certain things, but she was certainly not a true believer. Like she watched West German TV. She like her favorite shows were like the game show Dalli Dalli. I don't know if at least Germans do remember this, which was like very famous in the 70s, I believe, or like US shows like Dynasty. So these were like things that she definitely watched. She was able to travel as a retiree. You were able to travel to West Germany, and I think she had some relative in West Berlin, which I don't really remember too much, but I know that she traveled. So she was certainly not a true believer, although she had some beliefs that, you know, were just beliefs she had, like through her upbringing, and obviously also through the marriage to my grandfather.
With your father being an actor, did you ever have any want to be on stage at all?
That is a very, very good question. Yes, well, yes and no. So obviously, growing up in this with actors, and as I said before, these are like very, very interesting people. Interesting in terms of like being open, being funny, you know, like living a different lifestyle, so to speak. So when I was, I believe, 12 or 13 or 11, 12, somewhere around that age, early teenager, I actually did go on stage. So there were two plays that I played in. One was, it was like a fairly big one. It was The Life of Galileo, which was like Bert Brecht, and it was like really a three people play, and it was fairly long. And I played the kid Andrea, which was lots and lots of text to memorize, and but that was like all local. What was more interesting was a fairly big play, which was The Day of the Commune, also Bert Brecht, where I played one of the kids, and that was a very, very political play in Rostock, and fairly famous. Like, there were two things or two side stories to this. One was, through this play, I actually met Egon Krenz, who was the head of the Freie Deutsche Jugend at that point, because he attended one of those plays, and then afterwards there was a reception. So I can say I really actually met this guy, although, you know, it was just like saying hello and shaking hands. And the other one was that I was almost traveling on an engagement to West Germany, because they also did guest engagements in West Germany.
I think I know the answer, but what were their reasons for not allowing you to travel to West Germany? What excuse did they give you?
Yeah. So it was actually funny. So this was by invitation from like some east leaning organizations, and the engagement was in Augsburg, and they told me that, yeah, it's like they cannot guarantee for the safety of the children. There was another kid, and that was the reason that they basically said, because of safety. And in Augsburg, there were like lots of neo Nazis, and they couldn't guarantee the safety, and that was the reason that I couldn't go. I mean, obviously there was the hope that I can go with my dad, but it was, I mean, like in hindsight, it was absolutely clear and logical that they wouldn't let leave the father and the son at the same time.
So did they still use a kid in the play when they went to Augsburg?
Yeah, they did. And what I don't know is if these were like other East German kids that traveled, or if they used like local kids, that, because the role was not, I mean, like, not that you really had a lot of text. That was more like, you go there, you go there, and you go there. I asked my dad, and he couldn't remember either. So it was, but anyway, like, the story was, obviously there was like this big hope, like, yeah, maybe I can travel. This would be so super cool. And then like, no, that obviously doesn't work.
I'd be intrigued if they did actually take an East German kid with them, and why he was going to be immune to neo Nazis in Augsburg and you weren't. But we'll never know. We will never know. Did you stay in contact with your brother after the divorce? Were you in reasonably regular contact with him?
Yeah, so when they basically divided up and set up new families, it was kind of like discouraged to stay in contact, which is very, very sad. So I did not have too much contact. I mean, like initially there was um, like the letter or like the Christmas package, and sometimes early on vacations with my mother, but that all stopped. And it was kind of like encouraged by both new families because they were, it was a little bit about appearance too. So, like my mother was a doctor, her new husband was a doctor. They moved to this small village, and obviously, like the story that a mother gives away her kid is not always a good story. So they obviously had uh, some kind of like interest in not acknowledging or like fostering that
Yeah.
relationship. And the same went to on my father's side, right? It was the same thing. So he had a new wife. My stepmother had also a daughter, so I had a stepsister. There was always the situation that all of a sudden you are a different family. One gets nice presents, the other one doesn't. It creates some family issues, and so the contact was like totally lost until I believe I was like 16, um, when my maternal grandmother reestablished a contact. And obviously then I was at the age, my brother was at an age where, nobody could actually forbid us or keep us from reestablishing contact. And at that time, I just went to see them, and I reestablished contact with my brother, with my half brother on my mother's side, with my mother. And then what also happened at this time, her younger brother, my uncle, was there, and I reestablished contact with him, and he is playing a major role in the later part of my youth or life.
That must have been tough to be separated from your brother, because only a year
Yes.
difference there.
Yeah, it certainly was. It certainly was tough. But then, it's like also life gets in the way. So while you are separated, it's probably not that big of an issue. But once we reestablished contact, it was like a totally different story. Then that couldn't be taken away anymore. So my brother and I, we got along very well. We talked about all kinds of things. And it culminated, and later on that we also went on vacation together to Hungary, which was like later on when I was like 19 after school. So yeah, I mean, again, it was probably not too much missing somebody don't when you last saw this person as a child, as like a very young child, and then later on, that it couldn't be prohibited or restricted anymore after we reestablished contact. Yes.
How was your schooling? Did you enjoy school?
Actually, I did. So my school, I had like lots of so since I lived with my grandmother and was not really in this typical family bind. I had like lots of leeway with my grandmother. This was what grandmothers do to their grandchilds. So I had like a really really strong friendship with people in school, and I'm actually still in contact with them today. Um, so the school was actually really nice. I mean, there was like the political part of it, which everybody went through. But we did also lots of things that were, like outside school. So first of all, I have to say the school system, aside from, like these Staatsbürgerkunde or political things, we had great teachers, and we had teachers that were not really political. When I think about like physics or chemistry, we had like really, really great teachers there which were really focused on the subject matter and not the political part. I mean, I know the assistant headmaster, she was like a teacher at a very young age. I mean, I know she always worked on me and many others to get her quota, to get people to commit to a longer army service than the 18 months that were required. But we had like things, for example, outside school activities were like photography, and where you develop your own photos. And I knew somebody who had a photo shop who was retiring, so I was able to get my hands on photo paper. Somebody else did get some chemicals to develop stuff. So we experimented with photos, or we did like one of my friends had West German or Western records. So we did go into like a school room in the evening, like blacked out everything, and then we were listening to a record of Jean-Michel Jarre, Oxygen. And like these kind of things were absolutely cool. And these are the memories that stick. I don't really have bad memories from school, and I was like fairly good at it. So I was like always in the upper, I would say like 20%. The only thing I was really bad at was sports, and I dreaded the sports part of the school, which was like I think the annual or twice a year where you had to run the 10,000 meters, which was for me like it was always a nightmare. And that obviously was also something where I was, not thinking positively about joining the army, because obviously like the physical part was like a major part of it. Yeah, but I remember really from school, at least that part of the school, my friendships and like the people, like the folks I grew up with, and we had a fairly good, childhood in that regard, I have to say. Yeah.
You went on to secondary school.
Yeah, extended secondary school. Yeah.
Yeah, is that called Abitur?
Yes. Yeah. So there were if you wanted to go into like the academic route, that was the next step to go there. You needed to have like certain grades, and there were basically two ways, which was to go to the extended secondary school, which means you got your Abitur or A levels, which enabled you to go on to university, or you go to like a technical school where you learn a profession first, and then you do your Abitur or A levels on the side, which just took longer. And so I opted in for going to the extended secondary school, which was the Erste EOS, or First Extended Secondary School, Ernst Thielmann in Rostock, which was probably like, I think there were two, and that was like one of the main ones. Now there, my school story was like different, because it was first of all, it was only for 2 years, so you don't build the same relationships. And there were a lot of kids from like feeder schools. And I say feeder schools, there was a school right attached to this where, like, I know a lot of them where the parents were in the Stasi, high Stasi officers, or had like party functions where these kids went into the school. There were a lot of focus on political science and on Russian language, and they fed into this as well. So it was kind of like a mixture of the people that came from that school and people that came from, I would say, like normal schools or the typical school.
How much military training was done with you at school? Because they don't just wait until you're conscripted into the MVA. There's still some sort of paramilitary training going on.
Yeah. So there was always in the regular school system, there were like events where people could join the Gesellschaft für Sport und Technik, the GST. In the extended secondary school, it is part of your education that you have to go to a camp for I believe it was 2 weeks. And if you didn't do it, you wouldn't get your Abitur. So it was like really mandatory. We went to a camp which was in Prero, which is like really by the coast. And you learn all kinds of things like weapons handling. They had these small caliber guns which looked like AK-47s. You did learn like this close combat tactics, capture the flag. It was like lots of stuff around physical education where you had to run. And one part of it was also, since Rostock, the entire coastline was actually border area officially. And there were restrictions on the beach. I think the restrictions were from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., where people were restricted to go to the beach. And part of that was for us to secure the border, the northern border, during that time frame in our training or in our education, so to speak.
Just so I understand this, so as part of your schooling, you were almost acting like border guards on this beach. What were your instructions if you saw somebody, I don't know, running out the dunes with a dinghy?
So yeah, we were unarmed. We did kind of like arm us with like sticks that we found. So what basically the task was to first of all to go through like the bushes and see if somebody did hide like an air mattress or any kind of like floating device that would then have to be reported. And the other part was then at night to basically patrol the beach. And then if something happened, if you saw somebody to escape or to try to get into the water, to raise alarm. And there were always these watchtowers in fairly visible distance. The beach was also patrolled by really armed guards at night. So we were kind of like always in groups of two. And we just had to patrol up and down the beach. And like the person that I was paired with, we were like really, I mean, it was kind of like interesting. You had like certainly adrenaline, like what happens. We discussed what would happen if somebody would run. And we didn't really know the answer. It's like, what do you do? Like, do you let them go and pretend you didn't see them? Do you raise alarm? I'm glad I wasn't in that situation, that anything happened. It was, I mean, if you think about it, it's like two kids at the age of like 18, just, what do you do? It was conflicting, and, I'm glad nothing happened, but, it was like a quite interesting experience, that's for sure.
I can imagine. Did you have any relatives that lived in the West?
My mother had two siblings, an older sister and a younger brother. So her older sister left East Germany before the wall came down. She moved to West Germany. I think she was 14 or 15. So my mother's younger brother, my uncle, he tried to escape in the 70s, and he was caught and went to a prison.
So how long was he held in prison for?
So he was, I think the typical conviction for attempted escape was, I believe, 3.5 years. But he was bought free by the West German government earlier. I don't know exactly how much earlier. I think he served probably like half his prison sentence before he was then bought free by the West German government and moved to West Germany. He was, I believe, be able to come back to East Germany as a West German citizen after an amnesty. And I think that was in the early 80s or something like this, where because normally you were restricted, right? You were persona non grata for quite some time. But I believe there was an amnesty, and then he was able to reestablish not just by letter relationships with his sister and so my mother and that part of the family. Yeah.
Right. And I believe you went on holiday with them to Hungary, where there's an interesting conversation with your uncle.
Yeah, it was so basically what happened when I reestablished contact with my brother and my mother. That was when my uncle was there with his wife, my aunt, which I hold dear in my life, and we really got into great conversations and we built up like a really, really nice relationship. It was like really super pleasant. And I had even with my brother like sometimes conversations when we said, obviously we knew like from his success in West Germany and my aunt's success in West Germany, like a little bit about that. We kind of like played like mind games. How would it be to try to, swim to Denmark, which was like the obvious choice when you lived in Rostock, or to escape, or so. My brother and I had these. We sometimes talked about it, and my uncle, he was probably like a little bit aware of this as well. So basically, what happened after my Abitur and before I was about to be conscripted to the army, I went on a vacation with my brother, and we went to Hungary, which was probably like the most open country of the Eastern Bloc at that time. Given that I had these conversations with him and with my uncle, as a surprise, they joined us in Hungary. And it was like totally a surprise, was super cool. Obviously, you could drive around in a West German car and you met all of them. And they took me aside and they came to Hungary for the main reason that they thought I would attempt an escape via Hungary into Austria. And they just wanted to say, don't do it. It's not working well. It's it's not, because they knew I had a desire to leave East Germany just because of all the things I experienced. And it was not, I have to say, it was not political oppression on my part. It was about, freedom, about like doing something different, about seeing the world, about freedom. For me, personal freedom. So anyway, we were talking about it. They took me aside, so making sure that my brother doesn't hear anything about it. And then we discussed whether or not there were any options. And they said the idea at that point was born to help me to escape to West Germany before I was drawn to the army. They didn't really know what to do, but they said, like, let's see if there are still some contacts that my uncle had from his escape, if they could find somebody to, just help organizing something like this. And he also prepared me for, what would happen if I was caught. So he said, be prepared. This is how prison life is. And we saw a lot of this in for example, The Life of Others, or like any other movies. It's like this sleep deprivation. It's about these interrogations, about saying all the same. Again, The Life of Others was probably like a very, very good depiction of that. And he also said, if we become aware, if something happens, we will immediately engage Wolfgang Vogel and then try to help, to make this, or to deal with this situation. But you have to be willing to you have to be prepared for these situations or for this outcome. And the worst case could be that you lose your life. So these are like things you need to be prepared. Now, at that point, they didn't know how they would pull this off, but just in case, they took a photo of me. We kind of like agreed on like a password, and we agreed on basically what would happen is, they said, we will send you a postcard with some kind of like time and date. And that's when, this basically is going to happen. And obviously, as you can imagine, when I came back from Hungary, I went to the mailbox like first thing in the morning, like every single day, and the postcard never came.
Postcard never came.
The postcard never came because all of a sudden I get a call from my mother, who said, "Hey, we are going to be in East Berlin, and your aunt from West Germany is going to be there. And since you're about to join the army, why don't you come and we spend a day or two in East Berlin?" So excitedly I went. And that's when my aunt basically said, so she pulled me aside. We have a way. So she gave me a couple of presents, which was West German clothing, and one of these like a suitcase. And she explained that to my brother, that he didn't get all these presents. Yeah, because we are not going to see Jack for a long time, because he's joining the army and there is obviously no contact and no ability. So he's getting a little bit more presents than you are getting. And she basically what happened, we stuck with the password. She said, you will get a call one morning where there's randomly a time and a date mentioned. You will be at that time, on that date, on the Alexanderplatz, the world clock, and somebody will approach you. The plan is for you to leave the country with a fake diplomatic passport via Czechoslovakia. And that's the reason why I got all these Western-looking clothing, so that obviously, like in typical East German clothing, you wouldn't really pass as a Western diplomat. And that was the plan. And yeah, that's how it all kicked off.
So you must have jumped every time the phone rang.
Yes. So I was not living at that time with my parents in the same apartment. There was like a little room in the attic in this multifamily home, and that's where I lived. So, but obviously, like for family meals and whatever, I just walked down the stairs and joined them. And like every morning, I was frantically waiting by the phone. So we had a phone since my stepmother was a doctor. So one of the privileged elite that had a phone. So at that time, I worked at the University of Rostock and made and was like kind of like an apprentice. I worked in a small research facility where they built something that I don't even recall what it was, to count cells in fluids. And one of the things was, it was like super, super interesting. And they always said, you can't tell anyone about this. And I'm like, why? It's like, yeah, it's like technology transfer. And I'm like, are you aware of like the West people to get hold of this technology? And they said, no, we are not afraid of the West. We are afraid of the East, that they would steal this information. So anyway, I was working there, and so I went to kind of like work every morning. And one morning, I was supposed to take the train to Bad Doberan and to pick up some films. I don't know what was on those films. It was something for the university or for this project. So I was sitting in the bathroom and the phone rang. And before I could get up, my stepmother picked up the phone and nobody answered. And she's like, hey, hello, what is this? And then she hung up. And for me, a world broke apart. So what am I going to do? I missed the call. Yet I had to go. So I left, did my trip to Bad Doberan, came back, and spent the entire afternoon after I was back in the apartment. And then at like 4:00, the phone rang again. And it was when my West German aunt's brother was on the phone, and he was telling me, yeah, and we're having a party and blah, blah, blah. And he gave me, and we have this on the 21st, and at like starting at 2, or something like this, something meaningless. And that's when I knew it was kicking off. And obviously for me, this was like a different chapter in my life started. Yeah. And as it happened, it was like the day after my dad's birthday.
So how do you start preparing for this?
So my dad had a birthday party. I said basically good night. I went up to my room outside of their apartment. I basically cleaned everything up. So I left all the keys. I left him a letter about, this is like what to do with my stuff. I just wanted to have a clean exit as possible. So I wanted to have to return the keys returned to the university, the people I worked with. So I just wanted to make sure that there was nothing incriminating or nobody had any disadvantage as much as it was in my power. I also knew from my uncle when I crossed the border not to have any East German currency on me, because that would have tagged on a sentence. Because it was illegal to export East German currency. So what I had was I got my allowance from my dad. Since I didn't really have like a checking account, you got like school money. I had, and he gave me a check. So I had a check and a check which I could cash, but a check is not currency. So from that point of view, I covered my base to just be prepared in case this doesn't work out.
When you were writing that letter to your father, you must have been thinking that I might not see him again.
Yes, that was basically what it was. So I basically it was a kind of like farewell letter, but it was mostly where I didn't really want to give a lot of things away, but I wanted to make sure that I just wanted to make sure to reiterate that nobody knew anything, and that there are no people, that there is as little impact as possible to anyone that was associated with me, whether it was like my friends, whether it was the people I worked with, and that my affairs were sorted so that people didn't have to search for things, or I mean, it was really just an idea. That was basically like it. Then I dressed up and I took like a 4:00 train to East Berlin from Rostock, which is like about a 3 hours drive or ride, which was interesting. I mean, I was like sitting there and there were people sitting across me and reading the Neues Deutschland. And I was like in a totally, I don't know. It was like a very, very strange feeling because I obviously was clothed in like really cool clothing, and I didn't resemble anything East German, yet I rode in a like second class train to East Berlin. So that all worked out. I went at the time that was set, which was, I believe it was 2 p.m., and stood at the world clock in East Berlin. And I didn't really have to wait that long. I think it was like shortly after where a woman, I still remember, she is blonde. She approached me with like the password we said. And then she said, like, hey, come on, let's go to this cafe and let's talk about things. And I believe there was a movie the other day where I saw people sitting in this cafe where you could oversee Alexanderplatz. And then it kind of like dawned on me that was probably the place that I went to. But she was super, super nice, and she took a lot of the edge away, where she said, hey, everything is going to be fine. And look over there are people getting married. This normally means luck, and everything will be cool. But what you will have to do, you will have to now go from here to Potsdam. And then you go to the Inter Hotel in Potsdam, and then somebody else will approach you. And I'm like, like, what is what is happening, and why doesn't this start now? But anyway, so I thought, okay, so what they want to make sure is like that I probably don't have a tail. And in hindsight, it totally makes sense, right? They didn't know me. They didn't really know my uncle and my aunt, although they put this in motion. So everybody was told a slightly different story to just not expose the people to more risk than they already took. So I traveled from East Berlin by train to Potsdam, and I did, like everything I remembered from any crime shows like Polizeiruf 110 or like the Tatort, or like any of those things where you think like, okay, so start tying your shoelaces very quickly all of a sudden and look back, or stand in front of like displays to see if there's any mirroring and you see people or you recognize people. And I didn't recognize anyone or anything. Little did I know, obviously, that probably this organization that helped me, that they were, like making sure that nobody was following me, yet they were following me. So for me, it was absolutely, I didn't recognize anything.
When the woman comes up to you in Alexanderplatz, can you remember what the password was?
Yes, the password was the password we did set in Hungary, back in Hungary, and it was ASSI, which has nothing to do with asocial or anything. It was the name of my West German aunt's dog at this time. That was the password. Yeah.
Wow. So did you have to give her a password and she gave you a password?
Actually, I thought about it. I believe there was some, and it was about the weather, but I don't really remember what it was. There was a phrase back. There was one, but I don't remember what it was.
It sounds like a classic password. I mean, I always, you imagine these spy movies where they meet up and the exchange is, it's snowing in Moscow, and the answer is, but it's colder in Bratislava, something like that.
Something like this. Yeah. It certainly was. It was like something super generic yet specific.
Brilliant. I love those sort of details, Jack. So just wanted to dig into that. So you get the train to Potsdam. Tell us about what happens at the Inter Hotel there.
So I was waiting at the Inter Hotel in the lobby, and then I was approached by a guy. He introduced himself. They only introduced themselves by first names, and he basically then told me what's going to happen next. And what was happening next was like totally different from what my family in West Germany and I was told. So it was not an escape with a fake passport via Czechoslovakia. It was directly in a diplomatic car via the border crossing in Helmstedt. So what happened was, he said, okay, he had like a big 7 Series BMW, or I think it was. And he said, so what is going to happen is we will drive onto the transit road between Berlin and Hanover. Then at one point, there will be a car behind us. We will stop at a rest station, and then you will swap cars and will go into the trunk of that other car. And that car will take you over into West Germany. So that's what he told me. We then took like a scenic drive through the countryside. And obviously, it made sense. He wanted to see if he had a tail. And then went on to the transit road, filed into traffic. And I believe it was 7:00 in the evening. And that was at the right time. That was when somebody flashed the lights behind him. And that was the car that was taking me over the border. So we exited at one of the rest stations and went to like a far darker part of the parking area. I went in with the guy that I met in Potsdam into the rest stop. and then walked out with the other person, went to that car, and then he popped the trunk and I went into the trunk. He said, be prepared. It's probably going to be taking about 2 hours or so. You have to be absolutely quiet, and then we'll take it from there. And that was what was happening.
What was your feeling at that moment? What were you thinking?
Yeah, it's, I mean, obviously it was on one hand exciting, and I knew it was, there was absolutely no way back. So, I mean, obviously I thought what could happen, the worst case would be that the trunk pops and you look into the muzzle of a firearm. But I kind of like put this away. It was more the adrenaline that kicked in at that point, and something was about to happen, and it was the culmination of like lots and lots of events that happened before. To explain my, like, how I felt through the entire thing, it's always, I say it's like having a tough exam, where you are totally nervous before the exam. You get basically the questions. You're relatively cool working through those. You hand it in, and then you are nervous again. Like, have you passed or have you not passed? And that was like the cycle that I went through. So I was like super nervous before the events. Once this happened, I was like relatively cool. And then I started shaking again after I exited the trunk on the western side.
Okay, let's just hold it there for the moment. What country was the diplomatic plates for on the car?
I believe these were either West German Berlin plates, so it was definitely a German diplomat. It was probably not a super. I don't know. I don't know how ranking the diplomat was. It was an Audi 100 at that time. So it was fairly. It was like relatively. I mean, it was not a luxurious car. It was like a fairly typical. But
potentially was a West German diplomat earning a bit on the side with the escape organisers.
Yeah. Yes, that's what I assume. Yeah.
So the car's going down the motorway. You can feel the speed.
You can feel the bumps, like on these plates.
The bumps where the separate sections of tarmac are on East German motorways. I've heard that a number of times from interviewees. And then the car slows down.
Yeah. So it was obviously super. It was like dark, although you could see like a little bit of reflection from the brake lights and from the air vents. So the car slowed down. I saw light coming in a little bit through the air vents. I heard voices, and it was like inching forward. I heard voices, but I didn't hear what they were saying, if you know what I mean. It was like just something which I blocked out. So I was like super quiet. And it was, again, inching forward. They prepared me for 2 hours. I have no feeling for what the time was, so I totally lost my time feeling. And then after a while, the car accelerated again, and again, without having a measure of time, then at one point, the trunk popped and I was let out. And what is actually interesting, I just watched a show which is on, I think it's on Apple TV, or it was somewhere, about the industrialist or CEO Gosen, who escaped from Japan because he was accused of by Nissan and Renault for embezzlement. So, and he escaped in a it was like a trunk for a musical instrument. And when they showed or reenacted this scene where he was like lying in there, going through airport security, having these air vents, and seeing just light coming through and hearing voices, that transported me back into this situation. So it's like very, very airy. but it was obviously a major relief once I got out on the other side. I just cannot describe it, and because it was like so unique.
So the guy who's driving the car stops the car. The boot opens. The fresh air of freedom from West Germany wafts in.
It smelled differently. It certainly did.
No brown coal,
Yes.
or less brown coal. I mean, you must be just overjoyed at
Yeah.
that point, or are you a little bit sad at what you've left behind as well?
Not at that point, because when I made the decision, I kind of like mentally did make the separation, and I knew that I was leaving things behind, and was leaving family behind, and also was leaving friends behind. At that point, I didn't think it did set in. It was more the excitement for having made it and for something new to come. And there was still like lots of stuff. So after I got out, we went into like one of these rest stop restaurants. And it's like when I had my first beer, and I still remember it was like a salami sandwich, because I really hadn't eaten anything all day. So I was like talking to this guy, and he's like, "Hey, congratulations." And then another person came to the table. And I still remember he had like white shoes. He had like, I believe it was also like a white suit. He took my beer. And I'm like, "Who's this?" And it turned out that was like the mastermind behind it, who then welcomed me, and then he took me to we drove to Hanover, and that's where he handed me over to my relatives that were waiting there, to take me home to my new home.
And they knew that you were out before you arrived with them.
Yes. Yeah. So they left their home. So they were basically told that it all worked out, and then they drove from where they lived to Hanover, and it was like some kind of hotel, like a Hilton or something, where we then met. Yeah.
And then what do you do in order to then register yourself as a refugee from the GDR? There must be some sort of protocol, like going to the local police station or something.
Yeah. So my relatives, they took me to where they lived, which is in Remscheid in North Rhine-Westphalia. And that was normally not a place where refugees from East Germany, or like refugees from, Hungary or the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, back then arrived in Bavaria. So it was like really deep in the west of West Germany. So the next morning, I went to the local police station, which was like really just basically like a few minutes on foot from where they lived and I then lived. And I went to the police officer on duty, and I basically showed them my East German Personalausweis, my East German ID card in blue. And I said, I'm here from East Germany, and I wanted to register. And I could see his face, like he did not know what to do with me. And he called his officer in charge, and that guy called then his officer in charge. And then they said, we have to sort it out. Why don't you come back tomorrow? And that's basically what happened. And I walked out again. And the next day I showed up, and they basically then informed themselves what to do with me. And they said, okay, so the next step for you is you have to go to this Notaufnahmelager, like this camp in Gießen, where basically all the East Germans or refugees were registered, and where you had a health check, and where it was started to put in motion to get your ID papers and your school diplomas registered, and all of these things. What was very interesting about that one, I was at that time the only one who actually came via a direct escape from East Germany to West Germany. the vast majority of the people in the camp were people that were allowed to leave East Germany legally, because that was the time where you were the major way to leave East Germany was either via Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or via these Ausreiseanträge, so these basically permissions to leave. So I was the only one who had like an original German ID, which kind of like did speed up the process to go through all of those, because I was kind of like a unique person amongst all of them at that time.
At Gießen, did they want to just check out and make sure you weren't a Stasi agent nipping over the border?
I think it was part of it. I think the main purpose was to get to start your identity, to get new papers, to get to start, like what's your health situation, and to get to start getting your papers, education, and all of this stuff in order, and able to enable your new life. But I also was ushered through several rooms with I believe were intelligence services, which did ask me about my background. When I told them I didn't serve in the army, obviously there was less interest, but they also wanted to know like how I escaped, and I was asked by my escape helper to not reveal any information, and that's what I did. I basically said, "Hey, I don't want to tell you," or I was asked to not to tell you. And I mean, I think they pictured it together that it was a professional and commercial operation, and that was basically it. So they didn't really push too hard, and it was not really of that much of interest. There wasn't really that much that I could provide that couldn't other people provide, or in a better way from value for them.
What's the next time that you have contact with your family in East Germany?
So I did obviously write. So the night or the day after I escaped, I did call my dad. He picked up, and I told him, "Hey, I'm not coming home, and I'm not coming home anymore." And he's like, "Why? What happened? What's the situation?" And I'm like, "I'm not in East Germany anymore." And there was silence, and then he hung up the phone. So that was the first contact with him again. He then did report this to the East German police, the Volkspolizei, and that's where then obviously everything got into motion on their part to try to identify how I escaped and what happened, because nobody had any idea, and it came as a total surprise. The first physical connection back with my dad, aside from letters, was in Prague a few years later. I believe it was in '88, before the wall came down, where we met in Prague. So that was the first time that I saw him like in real life again.
And how was that meeting?
Yeah, it was very emotional. It was, yeah, I mean, it was not for long. Well, it was actually, I think we spent almost like a week together. So it was in Prague where we met. We spent some time there, and he had a colleague in the Czech Republic who had like a holiday home somewhere outside, and we spent some time there. So we talked about a lot of things. Yeah, it was like super emotional. I did not tell him any details of how I escaped, and that was not really the purpose of this meeting anyway. He didn't really try to find out. It was just like a nice time being together and spend some time.
But the Stasi work a bit on your grandmother, though.
Yes. So when my dad kicked it off, they obviously tried to find out what happened, and lots of this activity I saw in my Stasi file. I mean, obviously, like all the letters that were written back and forth were, read and analyzed. Since my grandma could travel, she did visit me in West Germany. I believe it was probably like a year later or so, and it was really funny. She always tried. Oh, tell me how you escaped. And it was obviously that she was prompted with certain questions. Which was she was not a good actor, contrary to my dad. So it was fairly obvious what her intention was, but she didn't really try too hard. So I didn't really give anything away to her.
So you got the impression she was just going through the motions.
She was going through the motions. Yeah. I mean, I knew I wasn't giving her anything, and I mean, like at one point she just gave up, and it worked, as I could see in my file later on.
Presumably, there was some impact on your father and your stepmother,
Yes,
because of your escape.
Yes. So the best thing that I could do for my family in that I left back in East Germany, which was also my brother and my mother, was that nobody had an idea. Nobody knew. It was absolutely kept under wraps. So that means they were obviously all interrogated, and they didn't know anything. And if you don't know anything, you can't say anything. So, or you can speak the truth. So that was my only protection that I could give them. What happened to my dad was obviously he was taken off the he was stripped of the ability to travel. I believe my uncle as well, but that was I'm not sure if he was still traveling in his function. My stepmother, she probably had the most impact because she was a doctor, and she was about to, if I remember it correctly, she was about to go on to the East German cruise ship, the Völkerfreundschaft that they had, as a doctor, and travel there. So that was definitely under discussion, and obviously that was right taken off the table at that point. So they had obviously an impact on their professional careers, but that was basically the extent to it.
You mentioned your Stasi file a moment ago. Was there any other revelations in there as to how they were trying to find out how you'd escaped or anything else?
Yeah, in the end, they collected like some 600 pages on me. The What was most interesting for me was, like, first of all, what they all did to try to find out how I escaped. And like one of the things was they had a registry of like all car with like Western car that traveled any of the transit roads on this day. They also had a lot of information on the vacation that I had with my brother in Hungary. So they knew about obviously my uncle and my aunt. They also tracked down like a guy that we had like a casual conversation with from West Berlin, because they thought he might have something to do with it. I had what was super interesting. There were like psychological profiles done on me from people that I went to school with in the extended secondary school, which wasn't really surprising because, as I said before, there were like lots of children of Stasi people that actually volunteered to go to do their military service with the Staatssicherheit. So they obviously put in an effort to try to psychologically analyze me. There were also like every letter that I sent or that was sent to me was in copy there with like some annotations where they tried to psychologically identify like why did I go, or was there any possibility to bring me back, or these kind of things. And there were references to my dad's file. So they were largely redacted, but there were certainly references to his travels, and like who reported on him, what he did, and these kind of things. So it was like all around like a very interesting read.
How did your family fare after the wall opened, as far as work?
My dad lost his job when there was no funding for the Volkstheater, which kind of like shrunk. So he moved from like one position to another. He eventually ended up with a small theater group that's called Company de Comedy, where he did. He also directed something, and that was he was still an actor until. He then retired. Yeah. And my mother, she then started her own practice, her own doctor's office until she retired. So they actually did fairly well after the wall came down.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos, and other content. Just look for the link in the podcast information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous support of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.